This is University Lecture. Welcome to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today, David Brower, former executive director of the Sierra Club, lectures on preserving our national heritage. Mr. Brower.
I stand before you a little bit frightened, because one of the things that always frightens me is, as a sophomore dropout, to stand before an audience on any university campus. And also, I'm from Berkeley. My daughter has just been traveling in the Southwest, and she found shortly that it was better not to say anything about Berkeley at all. So she was thereupon from San Francisco. But I can claim one virtue, that I did not come here by SST. Berkeley has been an extraordinary city, I think, and I've been watching it for a long time. I was born there and never left home. My wife was born in the South. She was born in Oakland. And the campus, we were discussing it on the way here, is really one of the saddest examples of landscape planning I know of. Among my other mistakes deep in my past were the mistakes of building dams on Strawberry Creek that ran through the campus. And I played some sandlot football because I was never able to play anything more. But there were many places to play on that campus, and there were hills behind it, quite beautiful and really quite wild. And when I was chasing butterflies there at 14 and 15 and 16, I made a map of the hilltops and the canyons where the cyclotron and the Bevatron and all these other things are now. And I don't know my way around the campus in Berkeley anymore. I can't find my way there. It is a campus without an open space program, and as a result, there is no open space. I could do nothing but admire the campus here, and I'm not just trying to make you feel good. It's beautiful to see open space on a campus. Berkeley, among other things, has had some fairly active students from time to time, and they started being active in their own way, quite a few years ago. How active they're going to be when our next quarter begins, I don't know. There are indications that they're not entirely in approval of Governor Reagan's recent actions, and there may be more action on campus than any of us wants. But back in the earlier days, when they were quite conservative, remember we had a group ACT on the campus, Active Conservation Tactics, and they started this business of making conservation pins you could wear. And their very first one was Fight Blight, Burn a Billboard Tonight. And they went on from there. Better redwood than deadwood. And they got people starting pins and slogans in that way. And I put in one myself. When you've seen one redwood stump, you've seen them all, in honor of our governor. Way back, slogans do have a value, and we got one on a population question way back then, and you've heard it since, but how dense can people be? And we got on to the sonic boom. Sonic booms are unsound, and then we thought of Los Angeles and its air problem, and so we had one for them. Let's keep our air visible, and believe me, they do. And now, so does Berkeley, and I'm glad to be away from it. The other one on population, which you may have heard too, I'm proud of this one, is good breeding can be overdone. Well, I have a few assorted notes and things that I picked up on the airplane and elsewhere that I will try to weave into a coherent speech. There's going to be a quiz in the middle of the speech, and if necessary, and if you wish to, you may quiz me at the end of it. I would rather hope you wouldn't. But I would like to put a subtitle on my speech. That is, I'd like to give a little introduction, as if I hadn't already. I'd like to talk a little bit about the crisis, as if you didn't already know there was one. I'd like to mention some ways out, historic and now. give you that quiz, then go into a rationale for an approach to solutions and say something about what you might do. That's my intent. Now, you may judge and grade me on whether I fulfill any of these promises or not. If I were to give a subtitle to this, it would be what our man Ed Matthews, who started Friends of the Earth in Paris, said in a little speech to us. He says, "No one asks, as we undertake these various things, what will it cost the earth?" So I'd like that to be the subtitle of the speech. What will it cost the earth, whatever we choose to do? And I'm quite mindful as I ask that question, in this second year of the environment that's beginning, that there are people around who are saying, well, the environmental concern is just a fad. And I say only those people will really think it is a fad who believe we have a spare earth if we mistreat this one. The serious theme should be the quote from Henry David Thoreau, "What is the use of a house if you haven't got a tolerable planet to put it on?" I think that's a very good question for us to keep asking. And then I want to give away the ending of my speech right now so that anyone who has to leave early will know where it's going to come out, is that we're going to make it. We're going to make it because, among other things, a good many people now in this country and around the world are becoming aware of what is happening to the environment, to the earth, to the planet, because it is happening so fast. They're becoming aware, perhaps, as one of the really great benefits of the space program and of that very first vibe we got, if you'll excuse my borrowing your term, when astronaut Borman described the Earth from way out there, this oasis in the incredible vast desert of space. This was all there was. He saw that clearly, and through his eyes and through the eyes of the people who landed there later, we saw it still more clearly. This is all there is. And we better do better by it than we've been doing it. But we're going to make it, I think, because we're suddenly realizing the problem, and we're going to make it not because of what we've done so far, but what we're going to do, let's hope, from tonight on. I've got a little list that I can preface here, a list of problems that have confronted us, but I'd like to start it with a little quotation, a very brief one, from George M. Woodwell, who was with the Brookhaven Laboratory of the AEC. And he puts it, I think he sums it up right here. We, man, all over the world, are now well embarked on a program of releasing unmeasured quantities of different kinds of biologically active substances into the general environment. It is one of the spectacular contradictions of our time that in the age of science, we should be entering blindly on 1,000 unplanned, uncontrolled, unmonitored, unguided, largely unrestrained, and totally unscientific experiments with the whole world as a subject and survival at hazard. I think that sums up the problem pretty nicely. And my own list of things that we need to worry about are brought to mind by my experience when I was talking in Gainesville not too long ago, and because I trusted the Hertz girl and her map, which she marked badly, I was 100 miles off course and late, and was moving rather rapidly toward Gainesville by an alternate route, and came upon the city limits and saw the sign there, slow down and live. And it was signed by the sheriff of the city, but I couldn't read that because I was going too fast. But I think that's one of the themes that we need to heed right now. How do we slow down and live? Because I think we must if we're going to. How do we do a whole series of things? And I've got a little inventory here, and if any of these problems interest you, please write us a letter and then volunteer for a task force to help. But how do we prevent this Trans-Alaska pipeline to carry oil out of the greatest discovery in the United States by a reckless route to a most dangerous coast and to the wildest ocean in the name of national defense? How do we prevent oil spills on the oceans? And we seem to read about a new one every week. How do we stop this reckless use of defoliants and pesticides and the other anti-life chemicals. In other words, how do we realize that when we try to knock out the spark of life in something we don't like, how do we realize that we are related to that very same life? There's a boomerang effect that we can almost count on every time. For a thing that strikes close to my home, my own operation, how do we free conservation organizations from what has been the tyranny of the Internal Revenue Service interpretations of what the tax law means and what conservation organizations may do without peril? For your own field, how do we really start on a master plan for the United States that throws away some of the old concepts of boundaries and section lines and really looks at the ecology, at the ecosystem, the life structure, the life support system of a given piece of earth, and starts from there, avoids the concept of a planner that my wife worked for at the University of California who really thought soil was old-fashioned. How do we end, among other things, the proliferation of nuclear reactors all over the country? Greater and greater numbers are contemplated now. We don't know quite what to do with the end products. How do we end this experiment of rattling our nuclear weapons by major blasts in Amchitka and a national wildlife refuge, frightening our friends and not really frightening our enemies very much in the process? How do we bring about a decline in the population? Because that's what I think we need. How do we establish criteria for peaceful stability in our economy? How do we discover alternatives to war? That's an old game that we can't fight anymore. Remember what Loren Eiseley says about that. A quote that I think should be in every book we have to publish and should be on posters. What we need now is not more brains, but a more tolerant people than one for us against the ice, the tiger, and the bear. The hand that held the axe, now out of some strange old allegiance, fondles the machine gun as lovingly. It is a habit man will have to break to survive, but the roots go very deep. That's one of the most powerful of the Loren Eiseley quotes. How do we really save wilderness, the birthplace of all life? I've got other questions, but that's a fairly good list for now, but we could sum them up. I think we have 10 years to mount, on behalf of the planet, a general global strike against sham progress to force the needed change. We can die of caution. Some people would rather die than change their habits. Do we? I had a good story the other night from a doctor who visited our neighbors and I was in. He had a story about some red corpuscles that were in a horse, and they were running the usual route from his brain down to his feet, back to his brain, then to the heart, and back to the feet, and back to the heart, and back to the feet with the signal from the brain. And one red corpuscle said to the other, "Why do we keep running on this same old route? Why don't we try a new one?" And so they tried going down the other leg and came back, and they ran into some phagocytes, and they gobbled them up. And the moral of that story is, never change streams in the middle of a horse. Well, I've got a transition coming up now. You've had the crisis, but you haven't quite had it all, because I think the crisis is epitomized. I'll get this paper out of the way so I won't give you that speech again. I think it's epitomized in what I have out of one of the least enlightened papers I know. It's Barron's National Business and Financial Weekly. And when I want to get depressed, I reach for Barron's. It's published by Dow Jones, who also puts out a very good paper that I admire quite a bit, the Wall Street Journal. But I got this one because it describes the ocean front, and it talks about the ocean conference that I happened to attend in Malta at the end of June and early July, Pacem in Maribus, seeking international peace in the oceans, ending up with what Justice Douglas called a not too encouraging a sign that now we wanted to exploit the oceans not for the few, but for the many, with the promise that the oceans would in any event die. But there were really good attempts to bring about some solution and the cooperative use of the oceans for the benefit of mankind. And I also wanted to add, and of porpoises and blue whales, but I didn't get that into the language. But The one line here that I think is one of the most benighted I've run into is this one quote: "Vague and ill-defined, the new oceans policy strikes us as a ploy to curry favor with the third world, the snarling pack of have-nots that controls the UN General Assembly." And when you can get little lines like that in national weeklies, you know that the crisis isn't over yet, and there are things to be done. I hope we can come up with some that we will want to do. But I would like to oppose Mr. Behrens with another opinion by Paul Ehrlich, with the observation that I think Paul Ehrlich is a young man, and I think that whoever wrote this for Behrens is an old man, evincing a kind of age that I think none of us can afford. And I define old men in this sense as an old man is a man who has made all his decisions, who has lost the ability to listen, and who has become a thoroughly practical man in the Disraeli sense, and that is that he can be counted upon to perpetuate the errors of his ancestors. I think Paul Ehrlich is moving in another direction. He was writing to a rather old man who was not nearly so old as the Behrens man, I'm afraid. But he said this: "To many young Americans, real improvement means a world with fewer and more lasting cars, TV sets, and so forth, less war, less racism, more joy. These things can be had with a declining economy. Both you and I can remember the days when life was good and our clothes were clean even without detergents, and when our beer was cold, coming from plain white Frigidaire in a returnable bottle. It's trite to say it, but our mistake was in equating the amount of junk we could own with what really makes life worth living. I'll still settle for wine, women, and song, all of which are biodegradable." Well, Paul Ehrlich isn't the only one who's been thinking of some good directions to go, and let me give you just a quick exchange here between Henry David Thoreau and Joseph Wood Crouch, who died very recently, and the world is poorer for that. But this relates a little bit to my own business, and that's why I bring it in. Thoreau said, you may remember this one, "We need the tonic of wildness. We must be refreshed by the sight of inexhaustible vigor. We need to witness our own limits transgressed, and some life pasturing freely where we never wandered." And Crouch was a student of Thoreau, and he wrote in an introduction to the Sierra Club book, In Wildness is the Preservation of the World, this nice exchange. He says, "Wildness is not sought for its own sake. Thoreau was no mere romantic admirer of the noble savage, and in Walden he makes this plain. But the human race has lost its way. The road upward from the savage does not lead to the cluttered, materialistic, desperate life." Just 100 years ago, Thoreau died. Before his death, he shocked a pious relative who had asked if he had made his peace with God by replying, "I'm not aware that we ever quarreled." In a century which has passed since then, no one has gone further than he along the road he chose, and most have turned their backs even more irrevocably upon it. The fact remains that the mass of men lead lives of less and less quiet desperation. And I think we have, in this next one from Thoreau, one of my favorites, and I think it must be sort of a favorite of the generation that predominates here tonight. "Remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth. Rise free from care before the dawn and seek adventure. Let the noon find thee by other lakes, and the night overtake thee everywhere at home. There are no larger fields than these, no worthier games that may here be played. Grow wild according to thy nature, like these sedges and brakes, which will never become English hay. Through want of enterprise and faith, men are where they are, buying and selling, and spending their lives like serfs." I like that one. And I like a derivative of it that came from Terry Russell, really Terry Sumner, who was one of the principal author of the Sierra Club book On the Loose. And it relates to this business of rising before the dawn and seeking adventure. And Terry wrote that beauty is not in the guidebook, adventure is not on the map. Seek and ye shall find. And so I think that's the transition to what now we should do as we seek and try to find something to get us into doing other things and have led us into the rather sad state of affairs that a good many of the parts of the world are in today. But this leads us to the quiz, because one of the things that I'm going to advocate doesn't sound too plausible, too popular at the first listen, but hang on, if you will. This is the question of how to use the system to beat the system, and to ask you if you've been doing it. And it'll require a little lack of inhibition on your part, going so far as to show up your hand now and then. The first question. On July 17th, I think it was, of 1969, President Nixon made a speech on population that was the strongest speech any president ever made on this subject. It is true that he gave in the beginning and took in the end, because this often happens, that we were on a collision course with the population crisis, but he didn't want to advocate doing anything that would bother anybody in his own private life. And that took away part of what he was saying in the first part. But in any event, it was the strongest speech on the subject any president ever made. Now my question is, did anybody here write to the president to thank him for the first part, the second part, all of it, or none of it? Could I see hands of anybody who wrote the president on his population speech? Well, did anybody, I'm not sure whether this is just an inhibition on hands, did anybody here not write him on that question? All right. All right, fine. All right, well, this isn't abnormal. It's just slightly abnormal. Usually in an audience this size, I might get two hands. I didn't see any tonight. But I would observe here, with respect to the system, that it still has political people leading it. Political people have a hang-up about being elected, and if elected, a greater hang-up about being re-elected, and I think President Nixon has this feeling. And if he makes one of the strongest statements that's ever been made and gets this kind of response, and indeed that was the kind of response he got across the nation, and John Ehrlichman told me this, then it's going to be a long, cold day before he tries that one again. And he'll talk about silent majorities. Now, maybe you've done better on this one. You may recall that one of the greatest threats to the forests of the United States was the so-called Timber Supply Act, which is, there was really a sort of a timber rapacity act, I think, if anything. And there was a major program. The Forest Service was for it, the Department of Agriculture was for it, the President was for it, and the conservationists across the country rose up and blocked it, and it didn't pass. In the story there's a sequel to it, but I won't go into that. But on the Timber Supply Act, presumably you're interested in the environment, or you wouldn't be here. How many people wrote on that subject, the Timber Supply Act? All right, it's not very many hands, but witness this. Of this audience, this size, you saw the number of hands. Those of you who were up front didn't have really any hands behind you. You saw how few hands there were. The Forest Service was for it, the timber industry was for it, the construction industry was for it, the Secretary of Agriculture, the President, it didn't pass. You people stopped it, just that handful. I got another one because this is coming up soon and it's close to my heart. How many here have written to their congressmen or their senators on the question of the SST? That's picking up. How many people here think we need an SST? How many people here think we don't need an SST? That's right. That's the right answer. That's the school solution. Now, if the rest of you would write, or even if 10% of you would write, we wouldn't have it. We would have $290 million to spend for something else. And the people over across the ocean who are fighting, racing like mad to get the Concorde up, because if they don't get the Concorde up, we'll get the SST up, and we're racing them for the same reason. We could save money all over the country, all over the world, and save environmental harassment, to say the very least. I have a footnote on that SST. I just picked it up, and you may have read the story too. The London Observer ran it first. You may recall that Sunday there was a Meet the Press, or whatever the program was, between Senator Proxmire and William Magruder, the president's SST salesman. And the figure on the number of Boeing SSTs we needed, Proxmire thought he didn't think we needed any, but we would probably never sell more than 200. The industry was talking 500. And Mr. Magruder said, well, 500 is a very conservative figure. We will probably sell 800. If we just sell 500, that fleet of Boeing SSTs would use up the entire discovery of the Arctic wildlife, the North Slope oil at Prudhoe Bay, 12 to 15 billion barrels in 3 to 4 years. Now, where would it use it up? It would spill some of that oil and its byproducts in the starting areas and all the noise and everything else, but most of it would be up at these elevations, these high elevations that it must fly at. So here is the entire Arctic discovery, at least the usable part of the airplane fuel of it, being spewed out, most of it, in this high stratosphere where we have very few figures on what happens, and all we have from MIT is sounds of alarm. And Mr. Magruder says on radio on Sunday that there is no evidence that there would be any pollution. Well, I don't want to go on into that, but I worry about it. And I worry about your not having written, those of you who didn't, to say that you don't want the SST, and the gentleman who does want it, please don't write. I think it would make a difference. I would like to share your guilt, those of you who have not written, because I haven't written yet either. That's the next mistake I've made. All right, we've had the test. Most of you failed the test rather badly, and I share your failure. I didn't write the President on Population on the Timber Supply Act and on the SST, and I'm paid to be a professional conservationist, and you're not paid. So that I'm sharing your guilt, but I'm also pointing out, and that's the moral of it all, that we can't really say the system can't bring about correction when we haven't given it a chance to bring about correction. So I would like to suggest that maybe there are things we could do that we haven't been doing, and we ought to give them a try. And I'd like to suggest sort of a rationale, a backdrop, a context for this try, and give you a perspective. It's a little litany I run through, and forgive me if you can for running through it, but I like it. Since I come from California, and since Max Rafferty has been dominant in our educational theories in California, and since he demands equal time for Genesis, if we want to talk about evolution, I thought, well, let's give Genesis equal time. Let's assume then that the 6 days of creation are balanced against or equated with the 4 billion years that we assume the Earth to be in age. That's about 8,000 years to the second, and it plays out rather interestingly in these comparative speeds. Creation begins then Sunday midnight out of some strange heavy putty or something or other that the Creator had on the back shelf. But in any event, mountains and earths and everything else were put together, planets, and this was all just an inanimate cosmos until Tuesday noon, at which point there was a cell, and in that cell were chromosomes, and in the chromosomes there were genes, and in the genes there was the idea, let's split. And they did. And there's been life aboard the planet ever since. And in that period, from Tuesday noon till now, that life, until almost now, that life has become more diverse, and out of that diversity more stable, and perhaps out of both, more beautiful ever since. And it's one of the things I think we rather like about the Earth, and the only Earth that we know of that's livable, or of which we know of no spare part. So we hurry on, as I don't want to take too long, and it's we can run right on through the schedule without going through all the geological epochs and without saying that it's about, when was it, Wednesday midnight, that the rocks that were to become the bottom of the Grand Canyon were formed. We can hurry right on to a very short time before midnight. Well, let's move right on through. Let's move through to Saturday morning and get over the rest of that rather dull week. At 8 o'clock in the morning on Saturday, there were
Lizard, shrimp,
stone crabs, I believe, and cockroaches. And they were so well designed, they're still aboard the planet. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the Age of Reptiles came on stage, and at 9 o'clock, it was off stage. But just before it left, there were redwoods, because Robinson Jeffers has told us in his poetry that the pelican remembers the cone from which the first redwood fell. That's redwoods and pelicans too. Pelicans slightly antecedent. 90 million years roughly then of pelicans. And we've just learned in the last 25 how to take care of them. The brown pelican, one of the great birds, I think you'll agree with me anytime you see one at work, is doomed. They live, perhaps up to 25 years, but the DDT in the ecosystem now, the global ecosystem, is such that it's mounting up. They're not having any breeding success. One bird out of the entire rookery area in California last year. But let's move on quickly, because we don't want to worry too much about pelicans, to, it must be about 10:30 at night, at which point the porpoises, who had been land mammals, decided to gather around the ocean's edge and go back to sea, where they've been very successful ever since. At 3 minutes before midnight, to skip a lot of things, man came aboard the planet. And for a long time, as hunter, gatherer, herder, burner to a certain extent, he didn't do a great deal of damage. Then he began agriculture, and he began to mine, and he began to learn about chemistry, and things changed quite rapidly. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It wasn't until 1.5 seconds before midnight that there was the first formal agriculture in Southeast Asia. And with 2,4,5-T and B-52s, we're taking care of quite a bit of that. At just less than a second before midnight, a seed sprouted in the White Mountains of California. A bristlecone pine began to grow, and it's still alive. 5,000 years, just about. A quarter of a second before midnight, long-haired, bearded type, anti-establishment, nonconformist, talking about peace and brotherhood and Christianity was aboard the planet. It's a quarter of a second. And I go through all that just to say that it wasn't until 1/40th of a second before midnight that the Industrial Revolution set in and started the whole series of events into action that we, in our rather dull moments, when we write financial pages or things like this, think can go on at that rate for a long time. We even think that they can double that rate for a long time and that we can get away with it. And I think I know a few people who join me in this, the people who think that we can continue the despoliation of the planet that we've been accomplishing in the last 40th of a second on into the next 40th at an ever-doubling rate are in need of psychiatric care. But they're still writing most of the financial pages. They're still writing a good many of the advertisements. And I can't help but bring out and display to you this, which is from the current issue of Look magazine. It's the center spread. And for those of you who have less than 20/20 vision, I'll read it to you. Let me read all of it to you, because I think it underlines one of the programs that you, if you use your rights under the system, can do something about. And it says, imagine, if you can, all the electricity this nation has used since the invention of the light bulb. And then it puts down all the light bulbs here, 1, 8, and 12 ciphers after it. That's how much we're going to need in the next 10 years alone. Now I'm getting down to the slightly smaller print. 18 trillion kilowatt hours is the amount of electricity we have used so far in this country. And 18 trillion kilowatt hours is what we'll need in just the next 10 years. In each of the 90 years since Thomas Edison invented the electric light bulb, new ways to use electricity have been developed. The vacuum cleaner, washer, dryer, refrigerator, and freezer range, electric heating and air conditioning, milking machines, water pumps, dishwashers, television. Many have become necessities. All this means more power plants and transmission lines. How many more? Picture a city the size of San Francisco. By 1980, we will need enough additional power facilities to power the equivalent of 299 more San Franciscos. America's standard of living and working depends on our ability to get them built in time to meet the need. and I like their semantics here, the people at your investor-owned electric light and power companies are capable, ready, and willing to meet this challenge, and do it with careful consideration for our neighbors and our natural environment. Some Americans believe sincerely that the need to preserve our environment and the need for more electric power are not compatible. We share their concern for America's cities, towns, and countrysides. We live here too. But we believe a balance between environmental requirements and America's electric power needs can be achieved, indeed must be achieved. We are backing this conviction with effort and money invested in making our facilities more compatible with their surroundings and developing better, cleaner, less conspicuous ways of generating and delivering the electric power you need. This is the spirit in which your investor-owned electric power companies are planning for the future. The generating plants will be built because our nation needs them, you need them, but we need the understanding of the people we serve in order to get the job done. That's why we set these facts before you. The people at your investor-owned electric light and power companies. Now, Tom Turner in our office has the name for that as eco-pornography. It's the attempt to take a major environmental problem down to the advertising agency and ask them to sweep it under the rug. We do not need that power. We absolutely do not. I will go along with Gary DeBell. What we need is 10% less power every decade. And this can be done. And I would like, I hope that Iowa State will forgive me, to say that I have taken the first step. I took it this evening. I'm over at the Memorial Union, and I'm in a very nice room. And I went into that room, and it's been nice outside today. The temperature is just, I feel at home at 50 degrees. And the air was good. It was clean, cleaner than I left at home. And I wanted to open the window, but I couldn't. It was blocked. There was a little block above the window. There was an air conditioner in both rooms. And I couldn't open either window. Well, I took my dime and undid the screws and took the block out and opened the windows. And the air outside was very nice. I didn't need those air conditioners that night, this evening. I don't need them at all. I need the air without the noise. And this is just the simplest example. There are all kinds of ways to stop using power if you once believe, as I do, that all power pollutes except solar energy. The 500 electrical servants each of us has, each of them pollutes some little bit. The hydropower dams a stream and puts some good critical stream bottom land underwater, which silts up and is out of action for centuries, or at least. Fossil-fired fuel stations are putting things into the air that we know we don't want there. We can improve the technology, but it's still not good. And we've got to go farther and farther, reaching for the fuels. We've got to strip mine the Canadian Rockies. We've got to go punching into the Arctic wilderness. We've got to drill offshore where we spill and spill more and more just to get this more and more power. The oil industry goes right along with your people at the American investor-owned light and power companies. They want to double all the oil-producing facilities by 1980. They want to invest as much money in the next 10 years in oil production as they've invested in the history of the industry. The energy threat is the greatest threat of all. Garrett Hardin comes up with one of the stories here that illustrates better than I did what is the matter with our thinking, what the need is for new thinking and what we do about the environment here. He was addressing some architects at Palm Springs not too long ago and said, I always like to stand before a group of architects and tell them what I think of their work. And he said, I've been looking at a lot of architectural drawings, and it's occurred to me that at least 90% of the architects of America do not realize that the sun exists. If you look at their plans, and if there's no north arrow there is no indication whatsoever in their design that they recognize the old fact, still unchanged, immutable, that in the northern hemisphere at least, the sun runs a southerly course. The south side of a building is warmer than the north side, but they do not take cognizance of this. And in the case of New York, they will build a glass house that becomes an oven if there's a fire. It has the windows plucked out if there's a big wind. But if everything goes all right, it becomes sort of an oven, just an ordinary quiet oven. And the heat comes in from the south side, and it warms the building up, and you can't move the panes because they don't want them moved. They lost too many executives in the Big Depression that way. So they're fixed, and all they can do is to go to Con Ed and say, we want a great big block of power so we can pump the heat out and dump it at the street. Now, a little bit of design, such as using wood, where they use thicker walls on the sunny side, would save them all that energy. This is just the simplest kind of change. In the use of energy, we could save quite a bit if our cars weighed half as much and we didn't drive them quite so fast. There are major savings that anybody can make. Well, I don't want to dwell on that any longer, except that we do need new insight. And new insight sometimes comes by surprising routes. And Gerhard Hardin's story again, that there was an Englishman 300 years ago who looked at his feet, and he finally said, well, you know what? My left foot is different from my right foot. So 300 years ago, he started to build shoes that were different for each foot. No one had done that before, 300 years ago. And then Gerhard Hardin points out, 30 years later, the British Army caught on. Well, we've seen something about the perspective, that this 40th of a second is something that we hadn't better pay quite so much attention to as we need to pay to the force that builds living diversity on the planet starting at Tuesday noon. And I think that with this concept of how we can get back into adjustment with our only Earth, we might make some progress in a really good way. My note paper here says 90-10. And this is just my very rough calculation. Don't pay too much attention to the exact figures, but the idea still works. That at this point, 90% of the planet, more or less, has felt the hand of man. Sometimes gently, quite often brutally. And 10% has not. Now it seems to me just beyond dispute that we can stop the kinds of abuse we're now inflicting on a planet, going out and finding new places to spoil. Stop it now or stop it later. We can assume, having gone this far, that we're at the end of a 90% planet, that there isn't any more. Just assume that. Conclude it. Believe it. And spend all our energies, our genius, our technology, our science, our humanity, our love of the earth and each other, in going back over that 90% and doing better. And, of course, there's no better place to start than with Manhattan. Now, we can go right on at a doubling rate and do what we've done for the last 40th of a second, but faster, and we can grind right through this last 10% of wildness. And then we're going to have to go back and use all our technique, all our humanity, science, and so on, to go back over and do better. Why can't we do it now? Why can't we stop these abuses right now and learn to live as if this were all we had, and leave that last 10% and this great fund of information that has come down to us and are essentially uninterrupted by man and his technology? Let's leave that for the answers to questions man has not yet learned how to ask. That's not an unreasonable position. That's all the wildness there is for all the people we ever expect will ever be here. And it is arrogant indeed of us if we think that we have to use it up, that a resource is not a resource unless we get it out and spend it, that the most important thing to do with the Arctic wildlife oil find is to get it out, that 2 million or 4 million or 6 million or 8 million barrels a day, just so that we can send SSTs hurtling through space, or other squanderings of a very precious resource that needs to last a long time. I would like to see us start with a 1,000-year plan. And I don't stumble into that 1,000 by any rational route, really. I just stumble into it, because I can't plan very well for tomorrow or the day after. But I don't think very many other people are planning too well. When you think of nuclear energy and the problems that have not yet got out of been matched by our wit, with the contaminants in the operation of reactors, these may be minor, they may not be. I tend to think they're not. But when you think of what we do with a high-level radioactive waste, you see what the problem is. So they want to put it in the salt mine in Kansas. Has anybody here studied what happens to what you do with high-level, very hot radioactive waste in salt mines in your neighboring state that has to be tended and kept isolated from the environment for 1 or 2 or 10,000 years? Round it off at 10. We've never really taken care of any problem for 10,000 years very well, except breeding rather excessively. And it seems to me that if we are going to insist on dumping on the future generations garbage that they're going to have to take care of for 1,000 years, then we are constrained to leave them a planet that has has some amenities on it, while they mind our garbage. It's only fair. I think that there's a potential, if you have this, if you kind of share this idea as an approach and want to work on it, there are many things that you can do about it, and I won't go into a great deal of detail about it, but you can, one thing, join organizations, and not just one, but several, and feel that there's somebody alongside that feels the same way and get that reassurance. That will help, and if that joining up includes the organizations I'm working for, the John Muir Institute, Friends of the Earth, the League of Conservation Voters, fine, we need help. But I think that the most important things is that you come back to the senses that have been building in you ever since Tuesday noon. Remember that from each one of us in this room, back to that Tuesday noon, there is one uninterrupted line of success. There was never a reproductive failure from that first cell right to you. So cousins, bear in mind the power of your own life. What can happen just inside? What happens behind your eyes, between your ears, and this extraordinary miracle, your head that powers you. Bear in mind what that can do if you want it to. Remember Rachel Carson, for example, who did her homework, minded her English, and cared, and made a great difference. Remember Ralph Nader, and how Detroit really has met its Nader. And be the Ralph Nader of your block. I think these are good things to bear in mind. And to bear in mind at long last and at all times what Robinson Jeffers told us in one of his most beautiful couplets. It is only a little planet, but how beautiful it is. I think that that's a good one to bear in mind. If I wanted to add anything to that, add an asa to that Pelion, I would simply try to put this forward as a pledge that you yourself might take. That we shall seek a renewed stirring of love for the earth. We shall urge that what man is capable of doing to the earth is not always what he ought to do. And we shall plead that all Americans and all people everywhere indeed, here now, determine that a wide, spacious, untrammeled freedom shall remain in the midst of the earth as living testimony that this generation, our own, had love for the next. That is the one resource, that's my final thought, that really we can't use up. The more you use, the more there is. That's the resource of love. A man has stressed his ability to be the aggressor. He's stressed it rather effectively. But he also has the ability to cooperate and to love perhaps as no other creatures have. And I would say that that's the good news tonight. There's still time for it. Thank you.
You have been listening to another in a series of lectures given on the campus of Iowa State University in Ames. Today, David Brower, former executive director of the Sierra Club, lectured on preserving our national heritage. University Lecture is a presentation of Iowa State University Radio.